You'll never be leadership material because you're too emotional for this industry. That was what my district manager said to me after I'd just closed the biggest deal in our company's history. Not congratulations, not thank you, just that cold dismissal that would echo in my mind for the next 3 years, as I watched 15 different people get promoted past me. I'm Captain Sarah Martinez, former Army Logistics Officer, current Senior Sales Consultant at Pinnacle Industrial Solutions, and apparently the woman who was too emotional to lead, despite bringing in $4.2 million in revenue over 18 months. Let me tell you how a company tried to bury a veteran who knew how to fight, and how I showed them that some wars are won not on the battlefield, but in the boardroom. Military service changes you in ways civilians never fully understand. 8. Years in the Army taught me discipline, strategic thinking, and how to perform under pressure that would break most people. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, managing supply chains that kept entire bases operational. When mortars were falling and equipment was failing, I was the one making sure our soldiers had what they needed to come home alive. I learned to think 3 moves ahead, to build relationships that mattered, and to execute plans with precision that left no room for error. When I transitioned to civilian life in 2019, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The corporate world had its own landmines, its own politics, its own way of dismissing people who didn't fit the traditional mold. Pinnacle Industrial Solutions specialized in heavy machinery sales to construction companies, manufacturing plants, and government contractors. It was a male-dominated field where handshake deals still mattered, and where being a woman meant constantly proving yourself in ways your male colleagues never had to. I started as a junior sales associate, and within 6 months, I was out selling. Representatives who'd been there for years. My military background gave me credibility with our government contracts, and my logistics experience meant I understood our products better than anyone in the building. I could talk specifications with engineers, negotiate terms with procurement officers, and manage complex delivery schedules that other salespeople found overwhelming. My first major breakthrough came when I landed a contract with Meridian Construction Group, a company that specialized in federal building projects. The deal was worth $800,000, more than most of our senior reps closed in an entire quarter. I'd spent 3 months building relationships with their project managers, understanding their specific needs, and crafting a proposal that addressed every concern they'd raised. When the contract was signed, the celebration lasted exactly 1 day before my success became somebody else's talking point. That's when I met Derek Hoffman, our regional sales director, and the man who would become my professional nemesis. Derek was 42, had been with Pinnacle for 12 years, and believed that sales was a relationship game best played by people who looked and sounded like him. He was tall, confident, with that particular brand of corporate charm that opened doors and closed deals through pure personality. He wore expensive suits, drove a BMW, and had never served his country or worked a day in his life where failure meant people died. Derek made it clear from our first interaction that he saw my success as an anomaly. During our quarterly review meeting, instead of acknowledging my numbers, he focused on my communication style and suggested I take courses on executive presence. When I asked what specifically needed improvement, he became vague, mentioning things like softer approaches and relationship building that sounded suspiciously like code for being more traditionally feminine. The irony wasn't lost on me. In the Army, my commanding officers had praised my direct communication and decisive leadership. I'd managed teams of 30 soldiers, coordinated million-dollar supply operations, and made split-second decisions under fire. But in corporate America, those same qualities were somehow deficiencies that needed correction. My second major win came 4 months later when I closed a deal with Titan Manufacturing, an aerospace parts supplier that needed specialized industrial equipment for a new production line. This contract was worth $1.4 million and required navigating complex federal regulations, coordinating with multiple vendors, and managing a timeline that had zero flexibility. I spent 6 weeks living and breathing this deal, working 16-hour days, and leveraging every contact I'd made in the defense industry. When Titan signed, our CEO personally called to congratulate me. The company newsletter featured my success story, and I was invited to present my strategies at the monthly all-hands meeting. For a brief moment, I thought I'd finally earned the recognition that would translate into career advancement. I was wrong again. The promotion cycle came in November, and 5 positions opened up across different departments. I applied for the ABC, Regional Account Manager role, a position that would have put me in charge of our government contracts division and represented a natural progression from my current role. My application highlighted my military experience, my track record with federal clients, and my proven ability to manage complex, high-value deals. Instead, they promoted Marcus Chen, a pleasant but unremarkable salesperson whose biggest claim to fame was maintaining existing relationships with 3 long-term clients. Marcus was competent, reliable, and had never challenged anyone or pushed for innovative approaches. He was also Derek's golf partner and weekend fishing buddy. When I asked Derek about the decision, he explained that Marcus had broader relationship skills and that the role required someone who could work well with diverse stakeholders. The coded language was becoming a pattern, and I was starting to decode it. Broader relationship skills meant he was comfortable in the old boys network. Working well with diverse stakeholders meant he didn't make people uncomfortable by being too direct or too competent. I didn't argue. I'd learned in the military that sometimes you fight battles and sometimes you gather intelligence. This was an intelligence-gathering moment. 3 months later, I landed my biggest deal yet. Pacific Infrastructure was a massive construction conglomerate looking to upgrade their entire fleet of earth-moving equipment. The project was worth $2.8 million and represented the kind of transformational deal that sales reps dream about their entire careers. It took 8 months of relationship building, countless presentations, technical demonstrations, and navigating the internal politics of a company with 14 different decision-makers. The complexity was staggering. Pacific needed equipment that could handle 7 different types of terrain, operate in extreme weather conditions, and meet environmental regulations that varied by state. They needed financing options that worked with their cash flow cycles, maintenance agreements that covered remote locations, and delivery schedules that aligned with project timelines spanning 3 years. I became an expert in every piece of DO. Equipment we offered, studied every competitor's specifications, and built relationships with Pacific's project managers, procurement officers, site supervisors, and executive team. I attended their safety meetings, visited their job sites, and spent weekends reviewing technical manuals to ensure I could answer any question they asked. When Pacific finally signed, it wasn't just a sale. It was a masterpiece of relationship building, technical expertise, and strategic thinking. The deal included provisions for future expansions, maintenance contracts that would generate revenue for years, and partnership opportunities that could lead to additional projects worth tens of millions of dollars. Derek's response was to schedule a team meeting where he explained how collaborative efforts had made the Pacific deal possible. He thanked the marketing team for their support materials, the technical team for their specifications, and the finance team for their creative payment structuring. He mentioned my name exactly once, referring to me as one of our representatives, who helped coordinate the client relationship. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the Pacific contract and realized that no amount of success would ever be enough. I wasn't fighting against incompetence or bad luck. I was fighting against a system designed to minimize my contributions and maximize other people's credit. It was a war I couldn't win through traditional means. But wars have taught me that sometimes the best strategy is to let your enemies defeat themselves. The promotion cycle came again in March, and this time I applied for the senior account manager position, a role that would have put me in charge of our largest clients and given me a seat at the leadership table. My application packet included detailed analyses of every major deal I'd closed, letters of recommendation from satisfied clients, and a strategic plan for expanding our government contracting division. The position went to Jennifer Walsh, a perfectly nice woman who'd joined the company 6 months earlier after her husband was transferred to our city. Jennifer had solid experience, a pleasant demeanor, and the kind of background that fit comfortably within Derek's vision of how business should be conducted. She'd never closed a deal larger than $400,000, had no experience with government contracts, and needed training on half of our product line. When I requested feedback on my application, Derek scheduled a private meeting in his office. He closed the door, offered me coffee, and launched into what he clearly thought was a supportive conversation about my career development. "Sarah, you're a tremendous asset to this team," he began, using the tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "Your technical knowledge is exceptional, and your clients genuinely respect you, but leadership requires different skills than sales excellence." I waited for him to elaborate, maintaining the neutral expression I'd perfected during military briefings. "It's about emotional intelligence," he continued. "Understanding how to motivate people, how to build consensus, how to navigate sensitive situations without creating conflict. These are areas where your military background might actually be working against you." The irony was breathtaking. He was telling a woman who'd managed supply chains under enemy fire that she lacked the emotional intelligence for corporate leadership. He was explaining to someone who'd built relationships with Afghan tribal leaders, navigated complex cultural dynamics, and maintained team cohesion during life-threatening situations that she didn't understand people management. "Can you give me specific examples?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he'd rationalize this perspective. Derek shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for direct questions. "Well, sometimes your communication style can be perceived as too direct. In situations where diplomacy might be more effective, you tend to focus on facts and outcomes rather than feelings and relationships." "Which situations specifically?" Another pause. "It's more about general feedback I've received. People appreciate your expertise, but they sometimes feel intimidated by your confidence." "Which people?" Derek was becoming visibly frustrated with my questions, proving exactly the point he was trying to make about my communication style. In his world, good employees accepted vague feedback gracefully and worked on unspecified improvements. They didn't ask for details, examples, or measurable objectives. "Sarah, I'm trying to help you understand how you're perceived by others. If you want to advance in this organization, you need to develop a more collaborative approach." I nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate the feedback. Can you recommend specific training programs or development opportunities that would help me work on these areas?" Derek brightened, clearly relieved that I was accepting his guidance. "Absolutely. There's an excellent executive presence workshop that several of our female employees have found helpful. It focuses on communication strategies for women in male-dominated industries." The workshop was scheduled for the following month, and I attended with an open mind. The facilitator was a cheerful woman named Patricia, who specialized in helping professional women navigate workplace dynamics and maximize their influence through authentic leadership styles. For 8 hours, I listened to advice about softening language, building consensus through questions rather than statements, and managing up through strategic relationship building. The other attendees were bright, capable women who'd been sent by managers who thought they needed to be more collaborative, more diplomatic, more traditionally feminine in their leadership approaches. We practiced rephrasing direct statements as collaborative questions, learned to preface our expertise with self-deprecating qualifiers, and discussed strategies for giving feedback without seeming aggressive. It was professionally humiliating and personally infuriating. These women were being taught to diminish themselves, to make their competence more palatable to insecure managers who preferred employees who didn't challenge or outshine them. We were learning to succeed by becoming smaller, quieter, less threatening versions of ourselves. But I attended every session, took detailed notes, and implemented every suggestion. I started prefacing my emails with phrases like, "I might be wrong, but," and "Please let me know if you disagree." I asked more questions in meetings instead of providing direct answers. I smiled more, spoke softer, and made sure to give credit to team members for insights they'd never actually provided. The results were immediate and depressing. Derek praised my improved communication style. Colleagues commented on how much more approachable I'd become. My ideas were suddenly being heard and implemented, even though they were identical to suggestions I'd been making for months. I was succeeding by pretending to be less competent than I actually was, and everyone was more comfortable with this version of me. It was a masterclass in how organizations punish authenticity and reward performance, but not the kind of performance that actually drives results. 6 months later, another promotion cycle opened, and I applied for the district sales manager position. This role would have given me oversight of our entire regional operation, including the team that Derek managed. It was a significant step up, but my track record clearly supported the advancement. In 18 months, I generated more revenue than any other individual contributor in company history. My clients consistently rated me as their preferred point of contact, and my deals had the highest profit margins in our division. The position went to Brad Thompson, a personable guy who'd joined Pinnacle 3 years earlier after his previous company was acquired. Brad was competent, well-liked, and had solid relationships across the organization. He'd also never closed a deal larger than $600,000 and had no experience managing people or complex accounts. This time, I didn't ask for feedback. I was beginning to understand that feedback wasn't really about improvement. It was about maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that certain people stayed in certain positions. Derek could always point to development conversations and training opportunities as evidence that the company was invested in my growth, even as they systematically promoted less qualified candidates past me. The pattern was becoming clear, and it extended far beyond my personal situation. I started paying attention to other women in our organization, tracking their career trajectories and comparing them to their male counterparts. What I discovered was a masterpiece of systematic discrimination disguised as individual development. Needs at Lisa Patterson in marketing had been passed over for creative director 4 times, despite developing campaigns that had won industry awards. She was told she needed to be more strategic, which apparently meant thinking less creatively and more conventionally. Amanda Foster in operations had been denied the logistics manager role twice because she was too focused on processes rather than people, which was particularly ironic given that her process improvements had saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, men with half our experience and a fraction of our results were being fast-tracked into leadership, positions where they could make decisions about our futures. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was just the natural outcome of a system that valued comfort over competence and familiarity over excellence. I realized that I'd been fighting the wrong battle. Instead of trying to prove that I deserved promotion, I should have been documenting why I was being denied promotion. Instead of working harder to fit their expectations, I should have been building evidence of their bias. Instead of accepting their feedback and trying to improve, I should have been preparing for the war they'd declared on my career the moment I'd shown them what real performance looked like. That's when I stopped trying to change myself and started planning to change everything else. The turning point came 3 weeks later when Pinnacle announced the arrival of our new chief operating officer. Richard Blackwood was being brought in from Apex Industries, our biggest competitor, with a mandate to modernize operations and accelerate growth. The company-wide email introducing him read like a corporate fairy tale. MBA from Wharton, 15 years of executive experience, proven track record of transforming underperforming divisions. What the email didn't mention was that Richard's last company had been investigated by the Department of Labor for discriminatory hiring practices, or that his proven track record included laying off 30% of their workforce while giving himself a $2 million bonus. But I knew these details because I'd learned to research the people who would control my future. Richard scheduled individual meetings with all senior staff during his first week, which meant that despite being repeatedly denied promotions, I was somehow considered senior enough to warrant his attention. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in the main conference room, the same space where I'd presented my successful deals and watched other people receive credit for my work. He was exactly what I'd expected: tall, silver-haired, with that practiced corporate charm that came from decades of boardroom meetings and country club dinners. His handshake was firm, his smile perfectly calibrated, and his questions revealed that he'd done his homework about our team's performance metrics. "Sarah Martinez," he said, consulting a tablet that contained what I assumed were my personnel files. "Army Logistics Officer, impressive sales record, consistently exceeds targets. Tell me about your experience with government contracting." For 20 minutes, we discussed federal procurement processes, regulatory compliance requirements, and the unique challenges of selling to military and civilian government agencies. Richard asked intelligent questions and seemed genuinely interested in my insights about market opportunities in the defense sector. "Your background gives you a significant advantage in this space," he observed. "Government clients trust people who understand their culture and constraints. That's not something you can teach in a sales training program." I agreed, cautiously optimistic that maybe this new leadership would recognize and utilize the expertise that Derek had consistently undervalued. "I'm curious about your career trajectory here," Richard continued. "With your performance record and specialized knowledge, I would have expected to see you in a leadership role by now." This was dangerous territory. Criticizing Derek or the promotion process could backfire spectacularly, but deflecting the question would waste an opportunity to advocate for myself with someone who might actually listen. "I've applied for several management positions over the past 2 years," I said carefully. "Each time, I've received feedback about areas for development, and I've worked to address those concerns. I believe my track record demonstrates my ability to handle increased responsibility." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of development? Feedback have you received? Communication style, executive presence, collaborative leadership approaches. I've completed training programs and worked to implement the suggestions. And how has that impacted your performance?" "My sales numbers have remained strong, and client feedback continues to be positive. I've also been more involved in team, projects, and cross-departmental initiatives." Richard made notes on his tablet, and I couldn't read his expression. "I'll be reviewing all personnel files and performance data as part of my assessment. I appreciate your time and insights." The meeting ended with pleasantries about my military service and his appreciation for veterans in the workplace. I left feeling cautiously hopeful that maybe things would change under new leadership. 2 days later, Derek scheduled an unexpected one-on-one meeting. His office felt smaller than usual, and his demeanor was noticeably more formal than our previous interactions. "I wanted to give you a heads up about some changes coming down from Richard," he began. "He's implementing a new organizational structure that will affect how we manage client relationships." I waited for him to continue. "We're moving toward a team-based approach for major accounts. Instead of individual reps owning client relationships, we'll have account teams with multiple touchpoints. It's designed to provide better service and prevent knowledge silos." This sounded reasonable in theory, but I suspected there was more to the story. "How will that impact current client assignments?" "Your government contracts will be transitioned to a specialized team led by Marcus. He'll be promoted to Government Relations Manager, and you'll be part of his team focused on technical specifications and proposal development." The room went quiet, except for the humming of Derek's desk fan. Marcus Chen, the man who'd been promoted, passed me 6 months earlier despite having no government experience, was now going to manage the clients and contracts I'd developed. "Marcus has never worked with federal agencies," I pointed out, keeping my voice level. "Most of these relationships took years to develop, and they're based on trust and technical expertise." That's exactly why you'll be supporting him, Derek replied smoothly. Your knowledge will be invaluable in helping him get up to speed. It's a great opportunity for you to develop mentoring and team leadership skills. The euphemisms were becoming more creative. Now my expertise was being reframed as a supporting role to help a less qualified colleague succeed in managing relationships I'd built. Will this change affect my compensation or title? Your base salary will remain the same, but the commission structure will be different since you won't be the primary account owner. Richard believes this team approach will be more effective for complex government sales. I did quick mental math. My government contracts generated roughly 40% of my total compensation through commissions. Moving to a supporting role would cost me approximately $30,000 annually, while requiring me to train my replacement. When does this transition take effect? Next month. Marcus will start shadowing your client meetings immediately, so he can begin building those relationships. I nodded calmly, as if this was a reasonable career development opportunity, rather than a systematic dismantling of everything I'd built. I appreciate you letting me know. I'll make sure the transition goes smoothly. Derek looked relieved that I was taking the news so well. I knew you'd be professional about this. It really is a great opportunity to expand your skill set. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine and a legal pad, mapping out exactly what was happening. The new COO's arrival wasn't bringing change. It was providing cover for the same systematic devaluation with more sophisticated language. Instead of denying me promotions, they were restructuring my role to diminish my autonomy and income while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. The pattern was becoming clearer. Richard's individual meetings weren't about understanding the team. They were about identifying who could be marginalized without obvious legal exposure. My military background and government expertise made me valuable enough to keep but threatening enough to contain. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Marcus begin his transition into my accounts. He attended client meetings where I did most of the talking, took notes on processes I'd developed, and asked questions that revealed his fundamental lack of understanding about government procurement. During a meeting with Pacific Infrastructure's procurement director, Marcus suggested a payment structure that would have violated federal contracting regulations. I smoothly redirected the conversation, but afterward, the client pulled me aside. Is Marcus going to be our primary contact going forward? She asked with obvious concern. He'll be taking on a larger role in account management, I replied diplomatically. Sarah, I need to be direct with you. Our contract with Pinnacle is worth millions of dollars, and it requires someone who understands federal compliance requirements. Marcus seems like a nice guy, but he doesn't have the expertise this relationship needs. I'll still be involved. In all technical and compliance aspects, I assured her. Good, because if that changes, we'll need to reconsider our vendor relationships. You've been our trusted advisor for 3 years, and we're not interested in starting over with someone who's learning on our dime. This conversation was repeated, with variations, across every major government client. They wanted assurance that I would remain their primary technical contact, and they made it clear that my replacement wasn't acceptable. I documented every client concern, every knowledge gap Marcus displayed, and every instance where my intervention was necessary to prevent problems. I also started tracking the time I spent training him versus the time I spent on actual revenue-generating activities. The data painted a clear picture. Marcus was consuming 20 to 30 hours per week of my time while struggling to grasp concepts that were fundamental to government sales. Client satisfaction scores were declining, and 2 prospects had explicitly requested that I be their primary contact instead of Marcus. 3 weeks into the transition, I received an email from Richard requesting a private meeting. This time, he'd reserved a small conference room instead of his office, and he'd asked me to bring documentation of my current projects and client relationships. I've been reviewing the feedback from our government clients, he began without preamble. There are some concerns about the transition process. I waited for him to continue. Pacific Infrastructure's procurement director called me directly to express reservations about the account management changes. She was very specific about wanting to maintain you as the primary technical contact. I can understand their concern, I replied. These relationships are built on trust and expertise. That takes years to develop. Exactly, which is why I'm reconsidering the organizational structure for this division. For a moment, I thought perhaps reason was prevailing. Maybe Richard had recognized that dismantling successful client relationships to accommodate internal politics was bad business. I'm creating a new position, Senior Government Relations Specialist. It would give you formal ownership of our federal contracting division with increased autonomy and a team reporting to you. This sounded promising, almost too good to be true. The role would come with a significant title upgrade and expanded responsibilities for developing our government market strategy. That sounds like an excellent opportunity, I said cautiously. What would the reporting structure look like? You'd report directly to Derek, but you'd have independence to manage client relationships and develop new business as you see fit. And compensation? Richard hesitated slightly. The base salary would be competitive with other specialist roles, and you'd maintain commission on your existing accounts. However, since it's a specialized position rather than traditional management, the total compensation package would be structured differently. I asked for specifics, and Richard explained that while my base salary would increase by $8,000, the commission structure would be capped at a lower rate to reflect my specialist status rather than management level. The math was elegant in its cruelty. They were offering me a fancy title and nominal salary increase while effectively reducing my total compensation by approximately $25,000 annually. I would have formal ownership of relationships I'd already built, but less financial benefit from the results. I'd like some time to consider the offer, I said. Of course, take the time you need, but I'd like to finalize the organizational structure within the next 2 weeks. As I walked back to my desk, I realized that this wasn't incompetence or poor planning. This was a sophisticated strategy to maintain my productivity while reducing my compensation and advancement opportunities. They needed my expertise and client relationships, but they wanted to ensure I remained in a subordinate position, regardless of my performance. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of fighting their system, I was going to let them implement it exactly as they'd planned. But I was also going to start building my own. The catalyst moment came exactly 1 week later, during what should have been a routine quarterly review meeting. I'd prepared thoroughly, as always, with detailed reports on account performance, client satisfaction scores, and revenue projections. My numbers were exceptional. Even with the transition chaos, I'd maintained 96% client retention and exceeded my targets by 18%. The meeting was held in Conference Room B, the smaller space reserved for individual reviews rather than team presentations. Derek sat across from me with a folder containing my performance evaluation, and Richard joined us via video call from the corporate office in Chicago. The setup felt formal, almost judicial, which should have been my first warning. Sarah, let's start with your overall performance metrics, Derek began, consulting his notes. Your revenue numbers continue to be strong, and client feedback remains positive. I nodded, waiting for the inevitable but that experience had taught me to expect. However, there are some concerns about your adaptability to organizational changes and your collaboration during the transition process. Can you be more specific about those concerns? I asked, maintaining the neutral tone I'd perfected over months of similar conversations. Richard's voice came through the conference room speakers with that particular clarity that made video calls feel artificially intimate. We've received feedback that you've been resistant to the new team-based approach and that you've undermined Marcus's authority with clients. The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. I've attended every transition meeting, provided comprehensive documentation of all client relationships, and spent over 60 hours training Marcus on government contracting procedures. Which specific actions constitute resistance or undermining? Derek shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for direct questions about vague accusations. It's more about attitude and perception. Some colleagues have noted that you seem reluctant to embrace the collaborative model. Which colleagues? Another pause. The feedback has come through multiple channels. The important thing is that we need to see more enthusiasm for working as part of Marcus's team. I let the silence stretch for a moment, studying Derek's face as he avoided eye contact. This wasn't a performance review. It was a preemptive strike designed to create documentation for future disciplinary actions. I appreciate the feedback, I said finally. Can you provide specific examples of behaviors I should change, along with measurable objectives for improvement? Richard's voice returned through the speakers. Sarah, we're not looking to micromanage your behavior. We just need to see that you're fully committed to the new organizational structure and supporting Marcus's success in his leadership role. I understand. And what about the concerns raised by Pacific Infrastructure and other clients about maintaining continuity in their technical support? Derek and Richard exchanged a look that was visible even through the video screen. This was clearly a topic they'd hoped to avoid. Client concerns are being addressed through proper transition protocols, Derek replied. Marcus is developing his expertise rapidly, and we're confident the relationships will be maintained. Pacific's procurement director specifically requested that I remain as their primary technical contact. How should I respond to that request? You should refer them to Marcus and offer to support him as needed, Richard answered. It's important that clients understand the new chain of command. I nodded slowly, processing the implications. They were asking me to damage client relationships I'd spent years building in order to prop up Marcus's authority, even though those same clients had explicitly stated their lack of confidence in his capabilities. Is there anything else I should know about my performance evaluation? I asked. Derek opened my file and removed a single sheet of paper. Your overall rating for this period is meets expectations with notes about improvement needed in teamwork and adaptability. The rating was a masterpiece of administrative manipulation. Meets expectations was technically positive, but would disqualify me from any merit increases, bonus considerations, or promotion opportunities. It was the corporate equivalent of damning with faint praise. I see. Can you help me understand how exceeding revenue targets by 18% and maintaining 96% client retention translates to meets expectations? Performance isn't just about numbers, Derek explained. It's about how you achieve those numbers and how well you work with others. And my approach to achieving these numbers is problematic in what way? Richard's voice cut through the speakers with obvious impatience. Sarah, this feels like an interrogation rather than a productive review conversation. We're trying to help you understand areas for growth. I smiled politely, the same expression I'd used with difficult commanding officers who'd tried to gaslight me about regulations I knew better than they did. I apologize if my questions seem confrontational. I'm just trying to understand the specific behaviors that need to change so I can address them effectively. The main thing is attitude, Derek said. We need to see more enthusiasm for collaboration and less attachment to individual ownership of client relationships. Understood. I'll work on adjusting my attitude. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. We all knew that attitude adjustment was code for accepting diminished responsibilities and compensation without complaint. Good, Richard said. We'll schedule a follow-up review in 60 days to assess your progress on these areas. The meeting ended with artificial pleasantries about professional development and team success. I walked back to my desk feeling like I'd just attended my own trial, where the verdict had been predetermined and the evidence was irrelevant. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in my entire professional career. I called in sick and drove home. Not because I was ill, but because I needed time to think without the constant surveillance of corporate life. I sat in my living room with my laptop and began researching employment law, particularly the documentation requirements for wrongful termination cases. What I discovered was both encouraging and sobering. My situation showed clear patterns of discrimination and retaliation, but proving it would require extensive documentation and evidence of disparate treatment. The good news was that I'd been unconsciously building that documentation for months. Through my detailed notes and performance tracking, I spent the rest of the day creating a comprehensive timeline of every promotion denial, every vague performance criticism, and every instance where less qualified men had been advanced past me. The pattern was undeniable when viewed objectively, but I knew that corporate lawyers were skilled at explaining away individual incidents as isolated business decisions. The next morning, I returned to work with a new perspective. Instead of trying to succeed within their system, I was going to document their system's failures while building my exit strategy. Every meeting would be an opportunity to gather evidence. Every performance criticism would be a chance to request specific, measurable feedback. Every interaction with Derek or Richard would be documented and preserved. But I also began laying groundwork for something more ambitious. During my lunch break, I researched Pinnacle's biggest competitors and started identifying companies that might value my expertise and client relationships. I updated my LinkedIn profile subtly, highlighting my government contracting experience and revenue achievements. I began reaching out to former military colleagues who'd transitioned to private sector leadership roles. The response was immediate and encouraging. Within a week, I'd received inquiries from 3 different companies interested in my background. 2 were direct competitors to Pinnacle, and 1 was a startup specializing in defense contracting that had been looking for someone with my exact combination of military experience and sales expertise. The most intriguing opportunity came from Vanguard Solutions, a mid-sized firm that specialized in government and defense contracts. Their CEO was a former Navy officer who understood both the military mindset and the value of veteran employees. During our initial phone conversation, he described a culture that prioritized competence over politics and results over relationships. "We've been tracking Pinnacle's performance in the government sector," he told me. "Your name comes up consistently in industry conversations as someone who really understands federal contracting. Would you be interested in discussing opportunities with us?" I was interested, but I was also strategic. "I'm always open to learning about new opportunities, but I'd want to understand your expectations and growth trajectory before making any decisions." "Of course. Why don't we schedule a formal conversation? I think you'd be impressed by what we're building here." The call ended with plans for a meeting the following week. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about my professional future. Meanwhile, back at Pinnacle, the transition chaos was accelerating. Marcus had managed to confuse Pacific Infrastructure's procurement team by suggesting modifications to their existing contract that would have required months of reapproval processes. I'd intervened to prevent a disaster, but not before Pacific's project manager had called Derek directly to express concerns about the account management change. Derek's response was to schedule another coaching conversation with me about supporting Marcus more effectively. This time, he'd invited Marcus to join us, ostensibly to improve our collaborative working relationship. "I want to make sure we're all aligned on how to make this transition successful," Derek began. "Marcus, can you share your perspective on how things are going?" Marcus looked uncomfortable, clearly aware that he was in over his head, but unwilling to admit it publicly. "The learning curve has been steeper than I expected," he said diplomatically. "Sarah has been helpful, but sometimes I feel like clients still see her as the primary contact." "That's exactly what we need to address," Derek replied. "Sarah, how can you better support Marcus's authority with these clients?" I'd prepared for this question. "I think the challenge is that these relationships are built on technical expertise that takes years to develop. Clients like Pacific have complex requirements that require deep knowledge of federal regulations, procurement processes, and compliance standards. Which is why Marcus needs to develop that expertise quickly, Derek said. What can we do to accelerate his learning? Well, he could pursue federal contracting certification, which typically takes 6 to 12 months. He could also shadow me on every client interaction for the next quarter while taking courses in government procurement law. Marcus shifted in his chair, clearly recognizing that I was describing a development timeline that would expose his lack of qualifications. That seems like a long timeline, Derek observed. Isn't there a way to transition the relationships more quickly? We could certainly try, I replied. But Pacific's procurement director has already expressed concerns about continuity, and forcing a premature transition could put those relationships at risk. Derek's frustration was becoming visible. He wanted me to magically transfer years of expertise and established relationships to Marcus without disrupting client satisfaction or revenue flow. It was an impossible request, and we all knew it. Let's try a different approach, Derek decided. Marcus will take primary responsibility for client communication, and Sarah will provide technical support as needed. That way, clients will start building relationships with Marcus while still getting the expertise they need. I nodded as if this was a reasonable solution. I'll support whatever approach you think is best. Should I brief Marcus on the upcoming renewal discussions with our 3 largest accounts? Absolutely, Derek said, looking relieved that I was being cooperative. What Derek didn't know was that those renewal discussions involved complex negotiations around multi-year contracts worth over $6 million combined. The clients had sophisticated requirements around equipment specifications, maintenance agreements, financing terms, and compliance standards. Marcus would be walking into meetings where any misstep could cost Pinnacle millions in revenue. Over the next 2 weeks, I provided Marcus with comprehensive briefings on each renewal negotiation. I explained the technical requirements, the client's organizational dynamics, the competitive landscape, and the specific concerns that needed to be addressed. I also documented every briefing session, every piece of information I provided, and every question Marcus asked that revealed his lack of understanding. The first renewal meeting was with Titan Manufacturing, my aerospace client whose contract was worth $2.1 million. Marcus had prepared extensively, using the IE materials I'd provided, but preparation couldn't substitute for years of relationship building and technical expertise. The meeting started well enough. Marcus presented our renewal proposal professionally, covering the basic terms and highlighting Pinnacle's strengths. But when Titan's engineering director asked specific questions about equipment modifications for their new production line, Marcus began to struggle. "Sarah, can you address the technical specifications?" he asked, effectively admitting that he couldn't handle the client's core concerns. I smoothly transitioned into the technical discussion, explaining how our equipment could be modified to meet Titan's evolving needs and walking through the engineering challenges they were facing. For 20 minutes, I essentially conducted the meeting while Marcus took notes. Afterward, Titan's procurement manager requested a private conversation with me. "Sarah, I need to understand what's happening with our account management. Marcus seems like a nice guy, but he clearly doesn't have the technical background to support our needs." "Marcus is developing his expertise in this area," I replied diplomatically. "I'll continue to provide technical support for your account." "That's not sustainable," she replied bluntly. "We need an account manager who can discuss engineering requirements, understand our manufacturing processes, and help us solve complex problems. If Pinnacle can't provide that level of service, we'll need to consider other vendors." The threat was clear, and it was exactly what I'd expected. Clients weren't going to accept diminished service to accommodate Pinnacle's internal politics. That afternoon, I documented the entire meeting, including the client's concerns and Marcus's inability to address their technical requirements. I also started a spreadsheet tracking similar issues across all the government accounts that were supposedly being transitioned to his management. The pattern was consistent. Clients tolerated Marcus when I was present to provide expertise, but they explicitly requested my involvement in any substantive discussions. Several had begun asking whether other vendors might be better positioned to serve their needs. I shared these concerns with Derek during our weekly check-in meeting, framing them as information he needed to manage client relationships effectively. "It sounds like we need to accelerate Marcus's technical training," Derek said. "That would certainly help," I agreed. Although some of these relationships took me years to develop, and the clients have very specific expectations about expertise and service levels. "What do you recommend?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. "I think we should be transparent with clients about the transition timeline and ensure them that technical support will remain consistent during Marcus's development. Period. That way, we maintain their confidence while giving him time to build his capabilities." Derek agreed, not realizing that he'd just authorized me to maintain primary client relationships indefinitely, while Marcus struggled to develop expertise he might never acquire. Over the following weeks, I watched Marcus become increasingly frustrated and defensive as he encountered the gap between his formal authority and his practical capabilities. He began scheduling meetings without including me, only to call for my assistance when clients asked questions he couldn't answer. He started making decisions about account strategy without understanding the technical implications, forcing me to diplomatically correct course during client interactions. The situation was becoming unsustainable, and everyone knew it. But instead of acknowledging that the transition was failing, Derek doubled down on his strategy. He scheduled another coaching session, this time focused on my resistance to change and my undermining of Marcus's authority. As I sat in Derek's office listening to him explain how my competence was somehow a problem that needed to be solved, I realized that this moment would define everything that came next. They weren't going to admit their mistake, adjust their strategy, or recognize that they'd created an impossible situation. They were going to blame me for their failure and use my expertise as evidence of my insubordination. That's when I knew exactly what I needed to do. The strategic withdrawal began that same evening. In the military, we call it a tactical retreat, not running from the enemy, but repositioning to fight from a position of strength. I'd spent months trying to succeed within their broken system, but now I was going to succeed despite it. Instead of defending myself against their accusations, I was going to document everything. Instead of trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I was worthless, I was going to build evidence of their incompetence. Instead of fighting for promotions they'd never give me, I was going to prepare for the opportunity they couldn't take away. My first move was to create what I privately called the Transition Documentation Project. I began meticulously recording every interaction with Marcus, every client concern, and every instance where his lack of expertise created problems. But I framed it as helpful support rather than critical assessment. I sent Derek detailed emails after each client meeting, outlining the technical questions Marcus hadn't been able to answer and the additional information clients had requested. I copied Marcus on these messages, presenting them as collaborative updates rather than evidence of his shortcomings. Derek and Marcus, I wrote after a particularly challenging meeting with Pacific Infrastructure. I wanted to follow up on today's discussion about their equipment modification requirements. The client had several technical questions about load, capacity specifications, and environmental compliance standards that will require additional research. I've attached the relevant documentation and can schedule a follow-up call to walk through the engineering details. Please let me know how you'd like me to support the ongoing relationship. These emails served multiple purposes. They documented the gaps in Marcus's knowledge, established my continued value to client relationships, and created a paper trail of my cooperative attitude. If Derek ever tried to claim I was being uncooperative or undermining Marcus, I had written evidence of my professional collaboration. I also began systematically archiving my work. Every client file I'd developed, every proposal I'd written, every relationship map I'd created, all of it was quietly copied to my personal drives. I told myself it was backup documentation in case of system failures, but really, I was preserving evidence of my contributions and preparing for my eventual departure. The beauty of this approach was that it appeared completely professional. I wasn't sabotaging anything or refusing to cooperate. I was simply being thorough, documenting processes and ensuring nothing fell through the cracks during the transition. Derek couldn't criticize me for being too organized or too helpful. While I was building my evidence file, I was also accelerating my external opportunities. The conversation with Vanguard Solutions had evolved into a formal interview process, and I was impressed by what I learned about their organization. They were growing rapidly, had just won several major government contracts, and needed someone with my exact background to lead their federal sales division. During my second interview, I met with their senior leadership team via video conference. The CEO, retired Navy Captain James Rodriguez, asked direct questions about my experience and seemed genuinely interested in my strategic insights about the government contracting market. "We've been tracking Pinnacle's performance in this sector," he said. "From the outside, it looks like they're struggling to maintain momentum with their federal clients. What's your perspective on their challenges?" It was a loaded question that could easily become a trap if I spoke negatively about my current employer, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate my analytical skills without appearing disloyal. "The government contracting market is becoming increasingly complex," I replied carefully. "Success requires deep understanding of regulatory requirements, long-term relationship building, and technical expertise that can't be developed overnight. Companies that try to treat federal sales like commercial sales often struggle with the transition." Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you think that expertise should be developed and maintained within an organization?" "I think it requires dedicated focus and investment in people who understand both the technical and relational aspects of government work. You can't just assign someone to federal accounts and expect them to succeed without proper preparation and ongoing support." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering my vision for building a federal sales division, my approach to client relationship management, and my thoughts on market opportunities in the defense sector. By the end, I felt confident that Vanguard understood my value and was serious about bringing me aboard. "We'd like to make you an offer," Captain Rodriguez said as the call was ending. "Our compensation package would include a significant base, salary increase, uncapped commission potential, and equity participation in the company's growth. You'd also have complete autonomy to build the federal division according to your strategic vision." The offer was compelling, nearly 40% more than my current total compensation, plus the opportunity to build something from the ground up. But I asked for time to consider it, knowing that timing would be crucial for my next moves. Meanwhile, back at Pinnacle, the dysfunction was accelerating. Marcus had managed to alienate 2 more clients by making promises about technical capabilities that our equipment couldn't deliver. In both cases, I'd had to intervene during follow-up calls to clarify what was actually possible and prevent contract cancellations. Derek's response was to schedule yet another coaching session with me, this time focusing on proactive communication and setting Marcus up for success. The irony was breathtaking. I was being counseled about not doing enough to compensate for Marcus's incompetence. "Sarah, I need you to be more anticipatory about potential client concerns," Derek explained during our meeting. "Instead of waiting for Marcus to encounter problems, you should brief him more thoroughly beforehand." "I've been providing comprehensive briefings before every client interaction," I replied. "Is there something specific I should be doing differently? Maybe more role-playing scenarios or detailed Q&A preparation? Think about what you would have wanted to know when you were starting out." The comparison was absurd. When I was starting out, I'd had 8 years of military logistics experience and a fundamental understanding of government operations. Marcus was starting from zero while trying to manage multi-million-dollar relationships. "I'll work on developing more comprehensive preparation materials," I agreed. Would you like me to create formal training modules that Marcus can review independently? Derek brightened at this suggestion. That's exactly the kind of initiative I'm looking for, something that could help him build expertise more quickly. I spent the next week developing what I privately called the Marcus Manual, a comprehensive guide to government contracting that covered everything from basic regulatory requirements to advanced negotiation strategies. It was actually a high-quality resource that demonstrated the breadth of knowledge required for success in this field. The manual also served as evidence of how much expertise Marcus lacked and how much additional support he would need to become minimally competent. Every page highlighted skills and knowledge he didn't possess, while documenting my willingness to help him develop them. When I presented the manual to Derek, his reaction was exactly what I'd expected. He praised my initiative and collaborative spirit, while clearly being overwhelmed by the complexity of what Marcus needed to learn. "This is very comprehensive," he said, flipping through the 40-page document. "How long do you think it would take Marcus to master this material?" "That would depend on his learning style and availability for focused study," I replied diplomatically. "Government contracting is a specialized field that typically requires several years to fully understand." Derek's expression suggested he was beginning to grasp the magnitude of the challenge he'd created by putting Marcus in charge of accounts that required years of specialized knowledge. 2 days later, the situation reached a crisis point. Titan Manufacturing's procurement director called Derek directly to express concerns about a proposal Marcus had submitted that violated 3 different federal regulations and would have disqualified them from their own government contracts. Received an urgent email from Derek requesting an immediate meeting to discuss client communication protocols and proposal review processes. When I arrived at his office, Marcus was already there, looking like a man who'd just realized he was drowning. "We need to talk about the Titan proposal," Derek began without preamble. "There seems to have been some confusion about regulatory requirements." I waited for him to elaborate. "Marcus submitted a proposal that apparently doesn't meet federal compliance standards. Titan is concerned about working with a vendor who doesn't understand their regulatory environment." "I see," I replied neutrally. Was Marcus able to get clarification about which specific requirements were problematic? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "They mentioned something about acquisition regulations and compliance documentation, but I wasn't sure what they were referring to." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus had just admitted, in front of Derek, that he didn't understand the basic regulatory framework that governed our largest client's business. "Sarah?" Derek said finally. "Can you help us understand what went wrong and how to fix it?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I could save the situation, preserve the client relationship, and demonstrate my indispensable value, but doing so would also enable the dysfunctional system that had systematically undervalued my contributions. "Of course," I said. "The proposal violates Federal Acquisition Regulation Section 15.304 regarding competitive range determinations, doesn't include required compliance certifications under Section 52-219-9, and suggests a payment structure that would conflict with Titan's own federal contract obligations under the Truth in Negotiations Act." Derek and Marcus stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "I can rewrite the proposal to address these issues," I continued. "It would need to be completely restructured, but we could probably salvage the client relationship if we act quickly." "How quickly?" Derek asked. "I could have a compliant proposal ready by tomorrow afternoon, assuming I can dedicate the full day to it." Derek looked relieved. "That would be incredibly helpful." "Marcus, I want you to work closely with Sarah on this to understand how these requirements should be addressed in future proposals." I nodded professionally, while internally calculating exactly how this situation would play out. I would save the Titan contract, document the extensive time required to fix Marcus's mistakes, and demonstrate once again that the accounts couldn't be successfully managed without my involvement. But I was also done saving a system that refused to acknowledge my value. That evening, I called Captain Rodriguez and accepted Vanguard Solutions' offer. We agreed on a start date 6 weeks out, which would give me time to transition my responsibilities professionally while preserving my reputation in the industry. "I'm excited to have you join our team," he said. "Your expertise is exactly what we need to take our federal division to the next level." For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about my professional future. I was joining an organization that valued competence over politics, where my military background would be an asset rather than something to be managed or minimized. But I still had 6 weeks at Pinnacle, and I intended to use them strategically. Next morning, I submitted my resignation letter to Derek and Richard. It was professional, gracious, and gave appropriate notice for a smooth transition. "I have accepted a position that will allow me to focus exclusively on government contracting," I wrote. "I'm committed to ensuring a seamless transition of my responsibilities and will work diligently over the next 6 weeks to document all client relationships and ongoing projects." Derek's reaction was immediate and panicked. Within an hour of receiving my resignation, he'd scheduled an emergency meeting with Richard to discuss retention strategies and transition planning. "Sarah, this is very unexpected," Derek said when we met that afternoon. "Is there anything we can do to address your concerns and keep you with the organization?" It was a fascinating question from someone who'd spent months systematically diminishing my role in compensation. "I appreciate the concern," I replied. "This opportunity is aligned with my long-term career goals and will allow me to focus on the area where I have the most expertise." "We could discuss adjustments to your current role," Richard offered via video call. "Perhaps more autonomy for the government accounts or a different reporting structure." "That's generous, but I've already committed to the new position." The truth was that no counteroffer could have changed my mind. Even if they'd offered me Derek's job, I wouldn't have stayed. I'd learned too much about their values and decision-making processes to ever trust them with my career again. Over the next 2 weeks, the reality of my departure began to sink in across the organization. Pacific Infrastructure's procurement director called Derek directly to ask whether I would be available for their upcoming contract renewal. Titan Manufacturing requested assurance that their proposal revisions would be handled by someone with appropriate expertise. 3 other government clients made similar inquiries. Derek found himself in the impossible position of trying to reassure clients that their needs would be met by Marcus, who everyone knew lacked the necessary background. The conversations were awkward, and several clients explicitly stated their intention to reevaluate their vendor relationships. I watched this unfold with professional detachment, continuing to work diligently on transition documentation while privately marveling at how quickly years of relationship building could unravel when trust was broken. The irony was perfect. Derek had spent months trying to minimize my importance and reduce my influence. But my resignation was exposing exactly how integral I'd been to the organization's success. They'd taken my expertise for granted until they were about to lose it, and I was just getting started. My final week at Pinnacle was a masterclass in professional warfare. Derek had become increasingly desperate, scheduling daily meetings to discuss knowledge transfer protocols and begging me to create detailed handover documents for every client relationship. He'd finally realized that losing me meant losing institutional knowledge that couldn't be replicated or replaced. "Sarah, I need you to be completely thorough in documenting your client management strategies," he pleaded during one of our sessions. "Marcus will need every detail about their preferences, decision-making processes, and relationship history." I smiled politely and agreed to provide comprehensive documentation. What Derek didn't know was that comprehensive documentation would reveal exactly how complex and specialized these relationships were, making it obvious that Marcus had no chance of managing them successfully. I spent my final days creating transition guides that were technically helpful but practically devastating. Each client profile highlighted the years of relationship building, the technical expertise required, and the specific military and government experience that had made these partnerships possible. Reading them was like looking at a job description that Marcus could never fulfill. Meanwhile, 3 more clients had called Derek directly to express concerns about account continuity. Pacific Infrastructure had been particularly blunt, informing him that they were already requesting proposals from other vendors as a contingency plan. On my last day, Derek cornered me in the break room for what he clearly intended to be a final plea for my cooperation. "Sarah, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I hope you'll consider remaining available as a consultant to help with the transition," he said, his voice carrying a desperation I'd never heard before. "I appreciate the thought," I replied, "but my new role will require my complete focus." What I didn't tell him was that my new role would involve competing directly against Pinnacle for the same government contracts he was now worried about losing. 3 months later, the dominoes began falling exactly as I'd predicted. Pacific Infrastructure terminated their contract with Pinnacle after Marcus failed to properly handle their equipment modification requirements. Titan Manufacturing followed 2 weeks later when their renewal negotiations stalled over compliance, issues that Marcus couldn't resolve. But the real shock came 6 months after my departure. Vanguard Solutions won the largest government contracting bid in our industry's history, a 4-year, $38 million deal with the Department of Defense for specialized logistics equipment. It was the same contract that Pinnacle had been pursuing for over 2 years. The difference was that Vanguard had someone who understood exactly how to navigate federal procurement processes, build relationships with military decision-makers, and deliver proposals that met every regulatory requirement. They had me. Derek called me personally when the contract award was announced. "Congratulations on the Vanguard win," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I heard you led the proposal." "Thank you," I replied. It was a team effort. But yes, I was the primary point of contact with the client. There was a long pause before he continued. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in discussing any partnership opportunities between our companies?" The audacity was breathtaking. He wanted to partner with the company that had just beaten Pinnacle for their most important prospective contract. "I'll pass along your interest to our business development team," I said diplomatically. 6 months after that, I received a LinkedIn message from Marcus. He'd left Pinnacle and was working for a small regional distributor, handling commercial accounts that didn't require government expertise. His message was brief but telling. I wanted to apologize for how things went down. "I realize now that I was put in an impossible situation. You tried to help me succeed, and I didn't appreciate it at the time." I didn't respond, but I appreciated his honesty. Marcus wasn't the villain in this story. He was another victim of a system that prioritized politics over competence and relationships over results. The real victory came a year later when Captain Rodriguez promoted me to Vice President of Federal Sales, making me the youngest female executive in Vanguard's history. My division had grown from a single-person operation to a team of 12 specialists, and we were generating over $60 million in annual revenue. More importantly, I'd built the kind of organization I'd always wanted to work for, one where expertise was valued, contributions were recognized, and advancement was based on performance rather than politics. Looking back, getting passed over for those 15 promotions was the best thing that ever happened to my career. It forced me to stop trying to succeed within a broken system and start building something better. Sometimes the biggest betrayals lead to the greatest victories. Sometimes walking away is the only way to find where you truly belong. And sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up giving you exactly the motivation you need to show them what you're really capable of. Derek was right about one thing. I was too emotional for his industry. I was too passionate about excellence, too committed to competence, and too invested in results to accept mediocrity disguised as leadership. But that emotion, that passion, that investment, those weren't weaknesses to be managed. They were strengths to be leveraged. And now, Every time I close another multi-million-dollar deal or help another veteran find their place in the corporate world, I remember that conversation in Derek's office and smile. He thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he helped me find it. Have you ever been undervalued at work despite your outstanding performance? Have you watched less qualified people get promoted past you while your contributions were dismissed or minimized? You're not alone, and your story matters. Drop a comment below sharing your own experience with workplace discrimination or career breakthrough moments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're building a community of people who refuse to let others define their worth. Remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming everything they said you couldn't be. Keep fighting, keep building, and keep proving them wrong.